So I was dealing with this basic issue we've had, where you have a layer 4 and layer 6A. That was the basic idea, and you have these bidirectional connections, and this is a location on the object. It's unique. We assume this is a sensory, if you will, sensory input in context. So it's already been sparsified to say, yeah, is this input in this particular context or in a different particular context? And so you represent the association between these two. One of the things we said, oh, well, if we don't really know where you are, you may have an input and you don't know the context yet. You might not know that, and so therefore you wouldn't be able to predict accurately what your location is. So we always said, like, well, if you have some sort of uncontext input comes in, it would lead to a union of locations, and then we propagate the union, and then we come up and get another input, and we sort of narrow it down. I never thought that would work because we can never figure out how you would propagate a union by a motor input, right? You have a motor input comes in here, and the mechanisms that we know about for grid cells, it's not clear. It's not at all obvious how you would propagate a union based on a motor output, right? You would get the next set of unions, a set of locations, and so maybe it works, but I could never figure out how it would work.
Yeah, like unless they're all kind of oriented somehow in the same way.
Well,
like if your movement is just the same movement through all of these spaces, then it doesn't matter. But in reality, there's nothing to constrain the spaces to kind of be oriented in the same way.
There's that issue. I was thinking of addition issue. The other issue is if you think about how grid cells are supposed to work, and we could go into that and go into the details of that theory. You're essentially assuming that there's some set of cells that are in phase, and those are the ones that represent something. And then I guess you'd be sort of propagating all the cells. Maybe we should walk through that. Yeah. Anyway, so what I wrote here was, so the way we've always assumed this worked is you have some sort of columns, mini columns. These are mini columns, right? And you've got a bunch of cells in each mini column. And this is the temporal memory algorithm. So your sensory input comes in, it runs to the spatial pooler. You select, some set of mini columns that represent that sensory input. And then you would randomly select one cell in each mini column. So all the active cells are in each column represents the columns themselves represent the sensory input, but then the unique combination of individual cells would be in context. And we've done a lot of math on this, saying how many mini columns would typically be in a real column, and there seems to be enough. It seems to be a good number. Like you could get a high enough unique representation here if you take maybe 200 mini columns or something like that. And of that, maybe 50 are active or 40 are active, something like that. But this has always been sort of a random thing, and the assumption is if you had it out of context, all these cells would fire at once, and therefore all the things that were associated with all the different possible features in all the different parts of the world would be projected down here at once. And then this also has mini columns down here. They're physically sort of the same, but there's a lot of evidence that they're actually logically separate from these. So the mini column active here doesn't necessarily mean it's mini column active down here. Under very constrained context, it looks like that. The context being like an anesthetized animal looking at gratings or something like that, out of context. But what do the mini columns down here represent? First of all, in layer 6A, there's lots of different types of cells. So we're not just talking about there's multiple types of cells down there. So we have to be careful about that. But one of the things about grid cells, and I don't remember how much we've discussed grid cells here, but a grid cell, of course, becomes active at multiple locations on an object. right? And the question is, what generates, how does a grid cell become active? And their basic idea here is there's two signals, there's two sort of sine waves are coming in, and when they have the same peak, the cell become active. And one of these is a voltage control oscillator, and the voltage related to the speed of movement in a particular direction. So if you're moving in a particular direction, the oscillation frequency of this one will change, and therefore this cell will become out of phase for a while, and then it becomes in phase again later on, right? And to make this work, you actually have to have a whole set of cells that all share the same movement vector, and they all share the same frequency, but they're out of phase. So they have different phases. All these have different phases going down here. This is not something we made up. This has been in the literature. And it's a bit speculative because not everyone writes about it, but I can't see another way of doing it. It's not speculative. I guess most people just don't write about it much. They just talk about how a cell becomes about. But if you want to have a whole set of grid cell arrays, a whole set of grid cells, then each of these things, you have to have for each direction, you have to have a set of cells that all seem to respond to the same movement, the same frequency, would be out of phase. And then, at any point in time, you have a set of these guys in different well, I'm going to assume those are mini columns because they all seem to have the same response receptive field, right? Which is what you see. And then at any point in time, you have some of these cells are in sync, and that becomes your unique input for where your location is. So if I were to look at all these cells and read out from them, and I say at any point in time, some are actually in phase, then that is a unique location of a movement in a particular direction. How far along am I in where am I in that particular direction? And so I've always been under the assumption, well, speculation, that that's what these mini columns are doing, because they seem to have the same basic response properties. You do see voltage, you do see speed moderated frequencies down here. And so the oscillation frequencies. So that's been my assumption and this, by the way, these aren't grid cells. These don't fit the definition of grid cells. A grid cell would be reading these out, right? But this is what you need to generate location. So let's stop there for a moment, if that's clear so far.
So this part, the oscillation part, this is for learning the grid cells, not for just using them.
It's for using them.
Just for using them.
It's for both. Essentially, if I just have movement, imagine I have, these are all, each of these mini columns is slightly different direction of movement. Okay. So, okay, I know there's a lot, so I don't know if there's a base frequency that, I don't know how to describe that, base frequency. And then, which is like coming from the thalamus. That doesn't change. That's our speculation. That's how you change it to change the scale of something. But there's a base frequency, and then each of these guys share that base frequency. But if you're moving in a particular direction, the cells in a mini column that match that direction, they also oscillate, but they oscillate at a slightly variation of that frequency based on how fast you're moving in that direction. I'm making this clear at all. I want to get to the problem we're trying to address in a moment here. So even independent of what anything else going on, if I just assume there's one cell active in each of these, in the mini columns that are active right now, so there's only a set of mini columns that are active because they sort of represent anything, like we're moving north. Well, north mini column and slightly less than north and slightly, these are all active at different amounts. Right, but the north one would be most active,
right? Higher,
and the others would be the frequency would be less, right? Of the frequency shift would be less. So so basically, if you just looked at the oscillation, the phase of all these cells, they're depending on if this column is moving faster than this column because this is north and this is northeast, and I'm moving north. Well, the phase on these will shift slower and the phase of these will shift faster. They're all still oscillating, but it's just the phase shift that matters. when I say phase shift, it's a slightly different frequency, which means the peak phase is different than it was a moment ago. That makes sense? Yeah, does that make sense? Yeah, okay. So this is the premise of which, and you would have to do this during learning because you would sort of randomly like up here, we randomly associated the active cell. Here, we assume they randomly associated the active cell here, meaning one that's in phase. That's the active cell, the one that's in phase. And in phase with the base frequency. And then as you move, then the one that's in phase with the base frequency would shift in some direction. So essentially, these would act like one-dimensional grid cells. It would say, like, I have maybe 20 cells here or 15 cells, and I have 15 locations I can represent in a particular direction by which is in phase with the base frequency. And so as I keep moving, I'll cycle through them again because, 360 degrees is all you got. And but the combination of these cells would be unique. So it's like a one-dimensional grid cell. If you look at the phase relative to the base frequency, which one's is in phase, that sort of tells you your location along one dimension, and that will cycle back around again and again. So it's not unique, but
yeah, and I guess the one thing, like, and maybe this is a distraction, but like, yeah, it's clear to me that it's like a one-dimensional grid cell in that it has like path integration in one dimension,
right,
and will like loop back around.
yes.
But I guess it's not obvious that it would have path integration in multiple dimensions. So like, if you took a new path around the object and got back to the same location, you're not guaranteed to have the same cells in phase. I mean, we could like.
Well, let's see.
See what it is,
Well,
something like that.
let's think about that.
Like if we just did like
Yeah.
a really, like, let's say, maybe this is like this is going left and then this is going up or something like that. And then this is going right and down.
Right, right. I think that the problem, maybe the problem you're having, if let's say I have a mini column that's going up and I have another mini column that's going down,
Yeah,
you're right, because this one would be active going one way, this would be active going the other way.
yeah.
Right, and that is a problem with this theory,
Yeah.
and so.
Which I guess you were saying like grid cells are almost like what read off of this, and then they have the path integration in the higher dimension.
I don't know if we've never resolved this, right? I'm not sure, I don't see any other way to do path, this is the way to do path integration. This is the only
Yeah.
proposal that really makes any sense. There is the continuous active, whatever it is, tractor network. I don't think that works, and I've talked to scientists about this, they don't think it really works either. It takes too many cells. So to me, the only viable method of doing path integration is the one that was laid out like this. It's again, not our idea. That you have a set of cells, each is representing a different phase. And as far as I know, that's the only way that anyone's proposed path integration can work. And it has all the right attributes because you have this phase shift, what do they call it? When the location comes active before the gamma, right, and then afterwards. Phase possession, I think it's called.
Okay.
So this is a problem. So there's another question. So these aren't really grid cells because for the reason you said, right? A grid cell always is active in the same place. So it feels in some sense like there's another set of cells that reads these things out that we would call grid cells.
Yeah.
And grid cells have these really weird things because for the life of us, we couldn't figure out how you could get a unique representational location using grid cells. Into the literature, there aren't enough grid cells, there aren't enough variation in grid cells, but this would get it to you. And so somehow it almost feels like, and other people have written about this too, so it's not completely made up, that this is the way you generate path integration. Then it gets converted into grid cells, which are actually of a form of the continuous attractor network. There's a paper about how grid cell, you need both. You need a continuous attractive network, and you also need the oscillatory interference method to make this stuff work. So somehow it's like you go over here, you activate a set of grid cells. These have persistent activation, and then they can reinstate the right things here, so you can do the path integration. No one, as far as I know, no one understands how this works. But these are pieces that seem to make sense. So the idea that you have these kind of cells, you have a continuous active, the CAN, which is actually the grid cells themselves. These are things that people propose, even if they're not generally agreed upon, in the grid cell literature. But they
And so
still,
the unique location code would be in the vector cells rather than the grid cells.
right, this is the only place I can figure out how you get a unique location code. And, so I don't know how you deal with the path integration through multiple dimensions, because this problem, I've never figured that out. I haven't worked on it too much. All right, so this is all preamble, to the problem of,
Yeah,
so let's talk about what your idea was. And I'll see if I can paraphrase it, but it's been a while since I thought about it. We've always assumed that, that if you look at our temporal memory algorithm, we would, when an input came in into layer 4, we assume that all the cells and all the minicolumns would become, in the active minicolumns would become active. So you'd have like, this is the input out of context. And then a moment later, it would inhibit, these cells would get inhibited, and you'd randomly pick an active one. If the cells were depolarized, meaning you had a prediction coming in from, let's say, layer 6, and you said, oh, I'm predicting these cells, then only those cells would fire, and you would never have this burst, and then a unique activation. And there are issues with that. I can't remember them all right now, maybe Subsec can remember, but that was the basic way we thought about this. And we always thought that the selections of these cells would be random, and we also felt that, now it's coming back to me. If I have a union of predictions, so I have multiple cells in these minicolumns that are active. We always said, okay, well, you activate all of them, you propagate that down here as a union. And I think what you were proposing, Rami, was that if I have a union of cells here, we always expect that the same representation will occur in the right context. So imagine I come in, I have a, let's say I have a union and I select a bunch of cells here and I narrow it down. We always under the assumption as we narrow it down to the unique one that was there before.
Yeah.
And you're suggesting perhaps that no, it's maybe not the unique one we had before. We have a union here. We may not narrow it down. So we propagate the union, but maybe after I do that union and I propagate it, maybe I select a different set of cells for the momentary. Okay, now we get into the heart of the matter, right? Because we always assume there was an input comes in, you activate the minicolumns, and if it's unique, you know exactly what it is. But if the prediction is not unique, or you don't have a prediction, you get a set of cells active. But when you activate that set of cells, you may reset what the actual representation is. I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
So if I had cell, A, B, and C were the correct cells for that representation, but I have a union coming in, and so I activate 20 cells. Maybe then those 20 cells, I narrow it down to 3 because I do the same algorithm, which is always like a burst, and then you pick a winner. Well, I might not pick A, B, C. I may pick something else. The 3 winners I pick would be D, E, and F. Or depending how much their overlap. If it's a big union, I could pick random ones. If it was a lot of overlap, I'd maybe just pick a few. But then you're essentially resetting what this representation is in this context. All right, that was a long way of getting something very difficult to think about. That's how I interpreted what you were suggesting.
Yeah, the representation that we're mapping to is going to change to go more towards the other predicted.
Well, it could be random. I mean,
I feel like you're suggesting that you just start with a totally new one.
I would pick from the ones that were in the union of predictions.
Yeah.
So it's not totally random.
Yeah,
And if I didn't have a union of predictions, I'd pick the same ones. So if I have a perfect match, then there's no drift. Like if I predicted exactly one thing, and an input comes in, and I only had one prediction, no drift. But if I had multiple predictions, like what if I have 2? I have 2 predictions. And so now I have the only place I would get drift is if I have a common minicolumn, right? So the 2 inputs have to have a common minicolumn, and now I had 2 predicted cells in that minicolumn. Well, one of them is the right one, and one of them is a different one. But what if at that point in time, after you depolarize both of those, you just randomly pick one at that moment in time?
Yeah.
So it wouldn't, all the cells wouldn't drift because you're only gonna exhibit the drift in a mini column where there were multiple cells predicted. If I had another mini column over here where I only had one prediction, I wouldn't get a drift. So I have to think about how much of it, that basically says you'd have more drift with more uncertainty. I don't know if that fits the literature or not, but that's what that would imply. So I guess the whole point of this exercise is I was taking what you suggested and trying to map it into mini column temporal memory theory. And then walk through the implications of that. So I'm not sure if there's an advantage to this. I don't know what this advantage is. But it would basically say if I have a bunch of predictions, all right, I'm sorry it took a long way to get here, but I have multiple predictions coming in. That means I got multiple cells, multiple SDRs active. Some of the mini columns, I could randomly pick the wrong cell for the new representation, and I start learning that. And so for those mini columns, I would exhibit drift. And then, of course, once I pick the unique ones here, I would now have a unique representation to pass down here, not a union. So I still don't know how to deal with the union down here. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't work. And so then the next thing to do is to figure out what if I just, okay, so I was supposed to do SDR A, and now I have, because I had a union, I have SDR A, prime, which is slightly modified from A, that's a drift from A. And then I'm passing that down here, and now I'm associating the drifted, the slightly modified SDR up here with the location down here.
But that slightly modified SDR is going to be more consistent over time.
Is it? I don't know.
Well, it's supposed to, we have a union of features at layer 4, and we're basically, every time I'm not sure about randomly choosing from the union of predictions, but if we basically over time kind of like pull them towards some sort of an average or a sample from these unions into just a single representation, then basically both features are going to be the same. Then
I don't know, how would you do that? You want to explain that?
Is that also what you were thinking of, Niels?
Yeah, we can.
I don't understand. Wasn't helpful so far. It was like,
Yeah, I think it was good to take the detour as well.
okay.
Yeah.
okay. Can I erase?
Yeah.
Maybe we just take a quick photo,
We have,
but the high resolution photo.
Great.
I don't think we're saving, but anyway.
Trying to erase everything just this way.
It's all the context. Okay, so this is the big two rectangles.
So the idea was if we have a union of predictions, then we would have multiple. So they don't have to be in the same column, right? So it's only sometimes it happens in the same column, but sometimes it also you get a prediction here and you get a prediction there, and maybe SDR A only has this column in it, and SDR B only has this column in it. But when you make a union of predictions, you could have this one and that one.
Well, you only have different columns if the input to layer 4, the sensory input to layer 4 was different, right? You have the
Right.
same sensory input, you have the same mini column.
Are we, just to clarify, are we talking about the example right now where we're like on a fruit bowl and it could be an apple or a banana?
No,
Or,
this is the extension of that where Jeff is trying to apply to just between in a single cortical column between the location and the cell.
Oh, why wouldn't that be applied to apples and oranges?
No, it would apply. The original idea was that I'd only use it for the hierarchical, but for generalizing that for as a
Right. In our conversation, it's coming back to me. In our conversation, I was more interested, you were thinking about hierarchical stuff, and I'm thinking like, oh, this could be occurring right here in layer 4. I think maybe even said, I don't know, but layer 4 could be doing this. And then I asked myself, could this method be working on all parts of the cortex where the unions are formed?
Yeah, personally, I think it would be easier to almost abstract away whether it's layer 4, 6, 3, whatever, and you just describe it as like
Well, it's helpful for me to sort of,
have that concrete Okay,
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, because right in this case,
yeah,
Rami said, oh, well, I might have different mini columns active, but that means I have a different sensory input.
Yeah, so
right,
that's why
so-
I'm asking about if this is the case. So if it's like a banana and an orange, it could definitely be the case that totally different features came in, so different mini columns are active. But
Right.
if it's like we have the same, like we
So-
have
so
feature
this
input
is
that's
really important.
consistent with two
I think-
objects.
I think it's really important because they have completely different features. The way I just described it, there would be no drift because the no mini columns would have shared, or almost none would have shared.
Yeah, so
predictions.
that's the example where we have like a can and a cup, and so far we haven't reached the handle yet, so it's consistent with
Right.
both of them.
So this would only occur when you have similarities between the two objects, which
Yeah.
is nice because that could, it suggested that maybe it has something to do with classification and, forming
Yeah.
more general representations, right?
yeah,
Right,
Yeah.
so observing a banana and a can, there's no drift going on, but if I have a can and something else, cup, then I might start having drift because there's some common features at locations.
but I think it could happen both with overlap in the features, but also overlap in their structural representation, because the same thing would happen, like, assume you've learned two different objects and they're relatively similar, like at a structural level, like, I don't know, yeah, two different types of coffee cups. Yet now you're sensing one of them. You're going to have this union active here, which is initially unique, but you're gonna have the union active here,
Maybe,
which is initially unique.
remember, I could never figure out how to get unions to work down there, remember that?
Yeah, okay, but if we had two different location representations active, coactive, the same thing is gonna happen, that these are gonna be feeding back here. And you have this kind of overlap in, like, okay, some cells are going to receive input from both of these, and that could bias those cells to be more active. And so that could again push these two locations to be more similar, or like to rather just sub-select a union.
I'm not following. that.
So I feel like it's just kind of basic Hebbian, like, if, as long as you have some sort of sparsely constraint, if you have like two different location representations. So the one in black and the one in green,
Yeah,
and these are for two different objects that are kind of similar. So there's going to be some cells that get green inputs.
yeah,
There's going to be some cells that get black inputs. And there's going to be, there's going to be some overlap in those receptive fields. And so these cells that have inputs from both.
but there wouldn't typically be many, right? If I have two SDRs, if similar sparse, the overlap would be very low in terms of those upper cells. It just would be, very few cells would get the input from most, if they're sparse. If the two inputs are sparse, then mathematically, there's very little overlap between, any particular cell in layer 4.
But there will be cells, like maybe not the ones that were originally active. Like, I mean, there's going to be a significant number of cells that get inputs from each.
No, I think that's not true. That's what I'm arguing. If it's sparse, that won't be true. I mean, you could use, what's the overlap between 2% representations? It's
Yeah.
very low. Maybe some, but not many.
I think the learning rule here is that what I'm trying to get at is that those representations will try to have more overlap over time. We don't want it to be exactly the same, but they're just gonna have more overlap.
Which two representations?
So these union of predictions, that union is going to be much less, many less depolarized cells are going to be happening over time.
Well,
Because they're always choosing from that subsample, they're always converging to more and more similar.
I see. So along what Niels is saying, essentially, the problem I have with that is because if I think about this layer 4, you don't want to think about it, you want to abstract it, but I'm thinking that layer 4, on a particular input, I'm specifying which mini columns are active. That's it. I can't pick a different set of mini columns. That's sensory driven,
Sure.
and I can't pick a different set. So all I can do is pick from cells within those mini columns.
But the thalamus is sending, like, what chooses, which layers here get active over time? Isn't there like,
which mini columns get active?
yeah,
Our assumption is you take these bits from like the retina, for example, and you run to a spatial pooler, and you essentially say, okay, I have so many mini columns, I'm now going to activate 30% of them, 20% of them. And the spatial pooler determines that. It's just like you take there's all these possible inputs and you narrow it down to a not a very sparse, distributed but not very sparse, sparse but not very sparse representation of mini columns.
the spatial pooler is trained also.
The spatial pooler learns to do that, and you have to assume that spatial pooler doesn't change very quickly. Right, you essentially say, okay, I've seen the world, I've seen all the sensory inputs from the world, from my patch of the sensor, and I've learned to represent them using a set of mini columns via the spatial pooler. And that becomes sort of your basis of which all learning occurs. If that spatial pooler changes, everything gets out of whack. It would be, it could learn differently, but my assumption so far is that the spatial pooler is not changing. Good.
Yeah.
I mean, we slowly drift the spatial pooler. If the world changed and you no longer have lines, and now all of a sudden you have little curves everywhere, well, the spatial pooler would change.
The other thing is, I'm just thinking to a certain degree, maybe this, this drift could be a bit of a feedback, kind of recurrent thing that pushes it more and more in that, like, okay, yeah, maybe there's not that much overlap initially, and so there's only a few cells that have enough input from each that they kind of form this new subset. But then that helps, again, you're gonna have these coactive, so that's gonna push these unique location cells. Any overlap there, those are cells are going to be more active. And just over time, if you're activating the same cells here, then by definition, there's going to be some set of cells up here that receive that input. And
if you activate the same cells, then I had a thought while you're talking, it may be what you're saying, but I lost your train of your thoughts. So if you want to do it again, or I can see.
yeah, just that it's a bit of a recurrent feedback loop where I see what you're saying, that, okay, there's only going to be a very small number of cells that, if these patterns are two totally different SDRs, are going to receive input from both. But let's say there's a few of those cells. So these are more likely to be active when you see those objects for either of those objects. And then, so these cells are always active in the context when you're looking at either of these objects. So there's going to be some, let's say, new location cells that receive input from these that are more likely to become active. And then there's going to be some new cell up here that receives input from these that's more likely to be active. And so over time, it might drift to
okay,
being more.
I'll go with that. Let me, that's a good idea. So I'm not rejecting it. I'm gonna add something to it. One of the things you know about grid cells, they don't seem to form unions, as far as we can tell. If an animal or rats in an environment, there's, a grid cell is active in a certain location of that environment. And if the rat is confused, doesn't know where it is, you don't see a union of grid cells. You see one grid cell active, and then when the rat, it says, oh, I know where I'm in, then it shifts to a different grid cell. So there's no evidence of unions of grid cells. There's more evidence, like I have a representation for generic space, and then now, no, I know where I am, and you try to throw away all the old grid cells, and you're now locked into a new set. So there's like.
Yeah, I'm curious. Do you know like a specific paper about this? Because I remember when I was working with like Marx's stuff, that I was trying to find a paper about like what are grid cells doing when a rat is confused.
Well, there are
Because I was curious
papers.
how much it fit with.
I don't have papers. I can't
Okay.
remember papers. You should know this by now. This is not a rare finding.
Yeah.
I don't believe in that course in the past that said that, and then it turned out to be rare. So, this is a general way. There's been a lot of papers that talk about when a rat doesn't know where it is, and then it does know where it is, right? And it locks it. And I believe.
Oh, kind of just like the re-anchoring.
It's a re-anchoring, but
Yeah.
it's not like a union and then you narrow it
Yeah.
down.
Yeah.
It's not like, oh, these are all the possible places I can be. It's like, no, I'm in this generic space.
Yeah.
And because I'm in a room, I have no idea where I am until I start seeing landmarks. And then I start narrowing it. And when I do that, the grid cells change, but they're not like a union being narrowed down. There's that, I think I believe that's the strong evidence to that.
Mhm.
So this is one of the reasons I kind of reject the whole union of locations thing, because grid cells don't seem to represent union of locations. Now, grid cells aren't the things I'm talking about here, the mini columns. That's the derivative of mini columns. By
I
the
mean,
way,
the same could apply between L3 and L4.
any of these seems to apply to channel
Yeah.
right? I'm not sure how to parse that statement, but yes.
Well, okay, yeah, I'm just thinking, okay.
Yeah, well, I think it could, but let's take, because grid cells might be unique too. Locations could be unique. It's a different mechanism. So where I was coming with this is, I'm trying to avoid using a union of locations. I'd rather stick to say like, hey, I have a set of assumptions about where I am right now. It may be generic, like I'm in the unknown space. And then when I start narrowing down, I jump to a different set of locations, like I lock into the correct set of grid cells.
So you're saying that the representation that gets activated is some random subset of the union of predictions, and we will not have.
All I was saying is, I'm trying to avoid having a union of location predictions. That I'm trying to avoid having the green and the black lines going up
But
simultaneously.
yeah, I mean, that's really interesting, but that feels like a radical shift in terms of like how we update the hypothesis space.
It
Because
does, right,
the
right.
whole basis for knowing which features to reactivate based on which reference frame you're in is based on the location cells being active. So I'm
Right,
not
right.
challenging it. I'm
No,
just
I am-
interested.
I'm
Or I
trying-
said like I'm interested now where this goes.
I
Like,
found this right. As I started off today, I said one of the problems I've always had, I can't imagine how unions of locations work.
yeah,
It doesn't fit the literature, it doesn't fit my models, it doesn't fit other people's models. It's difficult to imagine. So I never felt it worked. And when we said, oh, we're gonna propagate this prediction of locations, I was like, I don't know how that's gonna happen. It doesn't seem possible. So anyway, maybe it is possible. So I never felt comfortable with it. So now in this conversation, when this came up, I said, well, maybe there's a way of revisiting all this. And it is a radical shift in some sense. I'm not saying that the union prediction doesn't occur anywhere. I'm just saying right now I'm talking about the location cells and how
Yeah.
we know the location cells work. I'm enticed with the idea like, okay, maybe we can get away from the idea that you have a union of locations. And somehow this drift works with the fact that, if I'm going to understand the drift in layer 4 between layer 6A, I have to somehow accommodate the fact that layer 6A is not doing a union. It may be like shifting completely from one space, a location space, to a different location space.
Could that mean that we kind of might need to question the assumption if like objects have unique locations associated with them? Like, because if we have like a generic location space that lets us move through the feature space of different objects, that might mean that we don't need unique location representations
Well,
for each object.
Other than the fact that when an animal actually does recognize where they are,
Yeah,
the set of SDR, of the set of grid cells that are active become unique to that space. Like,
But then-
obviously, any particular grid cell will become active in many different places, right?
yeah. But then before that happens, it must have still somehow been possible to move through the feature space in a correct way to recognize the object.
Right, I think you're posing the problem more than.
Yeah,
in the
yeah,
solution.
more like saying maybe we need to question that assumption if it's always unique locations for.
Well, I don't know about that, it
Object.
could, it's possible, right, it could be that. I'm not sure why I need to throw away that assumption yet. I mean, it looks like grid cells, when an animal's in their environment, the set of grid cells are active tend to be unique. I mean, obviously, any individual grid cell can't be unique, right? The grid cell can't only fire in some environment. It has to fire in lots of all environments practically, but the set of them has to be unique. And it seems that that's what it looks like, right? When you look at the set of grid cells, they re-anchor. It may be a wrong assumption. Maybe I'm extending it beyond the data. I don't know. So I'm not willing to throw it. I don't know if I want to throw away the unique location yet. Is there an advantage for throwing it away yet?
yeah, I don't know if this is a cop-out, but it feels like, I don't know to what degree it's just like kind of a cell population question, like almost like there's something a bit more like place cells or something like
Well,
that here.
I don't mind place,
But that's supported by the grid cell population, which is, or whatever vector cell population, which isn't unique.
I mean, I don't know how we work in place cells into this. I've always wondered if the layer 4 cells are the equivalent of place cells.
Yeah,
And the layer 6A cells are, there's a grid cell population down there, along with these mini columns, which are the basis of grid cells.
but yeah, I guess we just start with like, what are some assumptions that we feel are necessary to be able to do reference frame based object recognition?
Yeah.
And then we can think about, okay, what are the cell populations that might enable that? Because like, for example, I feel like we have to, during uncertainty, we have to be able to move through multiple reference frames to test hypotheses.
Well, okay, I'm not sure.
Maybe not in the same moment in time, like maybe it would cycle serially through them, but there has to be some way to test multiple hypotheses. Otherwise, how would you ever narrow it down to the correct one?
Right, okay, right, it just, as long as we use the word test multiple hypotheses very loosely, because it may not be we do them thoroughly, there may be different ways of doing that.
Yeah,
Obviously, you have to somehow settle on the correct one, right? Whether you're
Yeah.
testing them, testing is a loaded word, but, it's really odd the way, like, how the grid cells re-anchor, and they kind of do it really quick, right? They just like, boom, they re-anchor. As soon as the animal knows where it is.
There's a projection from layer 3 to layer 6A, right?
I don't remember that. There might be, I forget, no.
I saw it in a couple of figures of
Yeah.
projection. So, I mean,
It's fun, you can find all those projections from any cell.
yeah, they are. So what, if we're assuming that there's voting and there's associative connections between all the columns, once a group of columns agrees on something or has more consensus on something, that is, there is going to force the layer 3 of the column we're talking about to have a specific object representation. That's going to very quickly drive layer
Right,
6.
right, that would be a good way of doing that, if from voting.
Yeah.
Right, so assuming I have multiple columns active, and
Yeah.
I'm ambiguous. I don't, my input's ambiguous, or I don't have an input, it's obscure, whatever, and all the other columns, oh, we're looking at a banana. Then I get layer 3 banana, and if that layer 6, you're right, if there's a layer, I think there is a layer 3 to layer 6 of prediction.
Yeah.
Check exactly what it was. Then you'd be able to say, oh yeah, well, I've associated banana with, but you don't associate banana with a particular location, you have to associate banana with somehow anchoring the layer 6A cells. Like, because banana doesn't tell what location I'm on, right? It just says, I don't know,
But a banana and a feature, both of them are going to can set the location.
Right,
Because we have
right,
those-
so I've had the feature, right, that would be a good observation, so layer 4 says, hey, I know the feature, so it's gonna be one of these set of cells in these mini columns. And layer 3 says, well, I know it's a banana. And so if I have an ambiguous feature, or, if it's just an edge and I don't know what the edge is, but if I know it's a banana, then that could really help me figure out where it is. something like that.
That would almost mean that each column is just testing one hypothesis and then
Well,
once
I don't
they
like that
reach a
idea.
consensus.
That's why I said this only works for the voting scenario. I'd like to solve it without the voting scenario, right?
Yeah,
I think that's pretty important.
I've added a second one. I don't know if we agree with that, just that a location in a reference frame should recall the correct feature.
Right.
I haven't said a unique feature, because if we're throwing out assumptions, then maybe.
Well, I guess really the question, is it a unique location, which I've always assumed, I've always wanted it to be a unique location.
Yeah, but okay, I haven't written, I don't know, I just thought, like, these are the computational requirements.
Right, but what do we mean by
Like
location?
algorithms.
Is it unique to the object? If it's unique, then it should recall the correct feature, right?
Yeah,
Right, should predict the correct feature.
yeah, I guess this is unique in the sense that it's a location in a reference frame.
Okay, great, right,
Yeah.
okay.
It's
right.
not
Right.
ambiguous which reference frame it's in.
Right, I think that's correct.
So yeah, I mean, maybe is it worth just thinking a bit about the serial one a bit, like this could almost relate to kind of frequency things and things like that,
Right.
where like at a particular frequency,
Right,
one
right.
hypothesis is being tested. at
Right,
another frequency.
that's exactly where I was going with the same thinking there. When you said testing, I was like, well, I'm thinking that exact idea. That you have, at a moment in time, you have one set of grid cells that are in phase, and the next moment, the different set are slightly in phase, but they're not in phase as much.
Yeah,
It's sort of like, this is like the phase progression in grid cells, right? They become active early, not as strongly, and then they, everyone knows phase possession, right? No.
Very well.
roughly, yeah.
The idea is if you look at an individual grid cell and it says, okay, I'm active at this location in the room. Well, that grid cell starts to become it starts to become active. It's active before and after that location. It's in the phase of it which it becomes active, it changes. Well, remember, there's a base frequency, whatever. I always forget the beta again. Whatever. There's a base frequency, and that cell becomes active. Its activity is peak activity in phase at this location. But if you move a little bit this way and a little bit this way, it's still overlapping. The two peaks of the waves they're not perfectly aligned, but they're slightly off. So the cell still becomes active here and still becomes active here. And the way it works is you're approaching, I think you're approaching, the further one becomes active first. And then, if you look at the grid cell, as you're approaching its point of maximum representation, it starts becoming active. The position that would be active here becomes active. Then it gets, so the position that's represented by the grid cells moves in phase space from here to here, with maximum activity here. So it's almost like at different points in the phase, different sets of SDRs would be active here.
wasn't phase precession in plate cells?
It's in place cells and in grid cells.
It was a Marxist.
So here you have a location in the space, and you're moving this way. Over here, you have SDR1, and then here you have SDR2. We're talking individual cells at this point. I guess we're talking individual cells. So this cell starts because as you're moving like this, and there's an underlying oscillatory frequency. This cell starts firing. It starts firing for all these locations, but when it fires, at first it starts firing here when it's overlapping. I don't know, I'm trying to remember exactly how this works. But the phase possession is that the cell actually becomes active over multiple locations with the maximum activity at its correct activity.
But that's not phase precession, I don't think.
I did.
That's
I
just
thought it
the
was-
phase of good cells. Phase precession is when it fires earlier or later relative to, like, the timing of the spike. That was like a.
Yes,
there
yes, right, but I don't think that's inconsistent.
But-
with
but-
what's in here.
I mean,
The timing of the spike is.
this is like a
You have-
phase,
you
this
have-
is a
you
phase
have-
shift.
You have an underlying. Like, so maybe this is this is the upper one, this is the base, and this
Yeah.
is the cell. So they're aligned here, that's perfect, right? And now this one's spiking here and this one's spiking here. And so, it's this different, isn't that what you just said there?
I think it's because, like, yeah, I think. At least when I think about this, it's more like each grid cell has like a preferred receptive field almost, like when it's on its exact location, then it's maximum firing rate. And then it tails off as you move away from that location, and then eventually goes back up again as you get into the phase of that grid cell.
Right, and the reason that is because the input to the grid, okay, so I'm confusing things here. These are the inputs to the grid cell. There's a base and there was this is these cells here, that it's these. I'm getting confused here, I'm sorry, but
No,
you've got the grid cell is firing at a frequency which is slightly different than the base frequency. Is it the grid cell or is it that cell? Anyway, and so when you get the maximum firing rate when they're aligned. When they're slightly off, you get a less firing rate. It's a lower firing rate. So because the cell is not.
okay, yeah, from this input, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
like, it's a lower firing rate.
Yeah,
So like this would be these cells here, I guess. But anyway, what you see is that it starts firing.
yeah, I get, but I guess
It's-
going back to like, can we test different hypotheses at different phases?
Yes, that was
ultimately
that's the
like,
question.
um,
Well, it's sort of like, as you're moving through space, it's saying, oh, you might be here a little bit, more likely here, more likely here, really likely here, less likely here, less like, it's like there's a distribution of where you might be. So it would, anyway, that's what it is.
yeah,
Let's go back to your 2 points here. The thing I would focus on is how do we make this work without a union of predictions coming up here? How would we make this
but
work?
then I think, should we just focus on the L3, L4 case?
Why?
Because then we're not talking about locations.
But I want to understand how it works.
Okay,
I-
I guess maybe this is wrong, but I kind of feel like the drift and pooling SDRs is kind of orthogonal to this issue.
All right,
but-
it didn't
but
feel
maybe
that,
that's
it
wrong.
didn't feel that way to me. It felt
Okay.
like, it felt like they're related somehow.
Okay.
Well, this is see if we can walk through the drift thing, deal a little bit more. Let me sort of review the drift idea. You have two inputs to this layer that if they're very, very different and therefore they don't share any mini columns, the current thinking is that in my head that there'd be no drift. It's only when the two inputs are similar or identical, then you can have drift because then you have multiple cells. You have the ability, you might pick a different cell active in that mini column. And that would only occur if the prediction from here led to multiple activities here. Multiple predictions here. I'm trying to figure out how it is that the drift idea works with the idea that you're re-anchoring down here as opposed to representing a union down here. That's what I'm trying to figure out. What would it mean to re-anchor? And maybe I'm stuck at that point. If you want to talk about layer 3, layer 4, that's fine. We can do that. I still want to solve the other problem, but maybe I don't have enough ideas about it yet. How would you face the problem in terms of layer 4?
maybe-
layer 3?
So if we assume that we have drift, that would kind of mean that over time we would represent similar objects with similar SDRs. So let's say we have the cup and the can. The only difference is that the cup has a handle. Over time, they would have similar SDRs. So let's say we are
That sounds good, but can you tell me how that would happen?
because of the representational drift. So let's say we're on the cup and we're moving only on the outside of the cup. We haven't sensed the handle yet.
Right.
So
What's going on with location? Do I have a unique?
yeah, so
space?
that's what I'm getting at
Okay.
with the re-anchoring. So let's say we would think we are on the can and we're testing the can hypothesis. We are in the location space of the can. And then once we sense the handle, it would quickly re-anchor on the bottom to the cup's location space.
Right. And then what happens? Where does the drift come in at that point?
Well, the drift would just mean that is actually possible because while we're not sensing the handle yet, the SDRs at the top would be the same and would work like even if we're in the, hang on.
Well, so
No,
listen,
yeah,
I
if we're
think
in
I'm
the
on the cup, I think I'm on the can. I have a unique space for the can.
Yeah, then.
Now
yeah.
I come along and now I have a feature which doesn't fit the can. So it's gonna mismatch, I have a misprediction, right? A feature that doesn't fit the can, and therefore my prediction from the location space is wrong. And now that has to somehow re-anchor the, that's just possible with that one new feature I know I'm on a cup now, or whatever, right?
Yeah,
That has to re-anchor the grid cell saying, oh, I'm not in the can, I'm on the cup.
But ideally, you wouldn't have thrown away, like, if that actually happened to you, I feel like you'd still have like a sense, okay, well, the cup is oriented like this in space, because I just felt its body, which I thought was a can at the time. But if up until that point you'd only been testing the can location space, then when you feel the handle, all you will know about the location of the cup is that you're on a handle.
Right,
Um,
so you
May-
So
I
I,
think
so I
you
feel
throw
like
everything away,
yeah, I feel like we still would want to be testing
Maybe because
the multiple locations.
if they share an SDR up to that point, like the SDRs are the same up to that point, maybe that would inform it to then test the cup hypothesis.
Yeah,
for the
so, I
locations.
mean, as in like, but then we still need to, like, ultimately, we still need to somehow be testing the movements to the location space, but like,
Yeah, I didn't think
whether
it-
you could have
yeah.
like, I mean, because we talked a bit about how like, do we want to merge graphs as well? So like, let's say you have a graph for like a cylinder or something, and then until you know whether it's a can or a cup, you're moving through the graph, the cylinder graph. And that's kind of updating both.
Yeah, I think what I was saying, it doesn't work with the idea that they have unique location representations. But yeah, if they would kind of share a location representation like the cylinder, that could be,
And then you,
well, okay, maybe this will be helpful. Again, going back to the grid cell literature. When you look at grid cells, we don't see these SDRs, right? We don't see, all we see is like, some set of grid cells are active, and then they re-anchor. And so, but what I'm really saying is there doesn't seem to be enough grid cells to form a unique representation. Right? So it's kind of two things at once. One says it does re-anchor when you go to a new object, but it doesn't look like there's enough cells to do a unique representation. They're not sparse enough. It's
Yeah.
like a grid cell. Okay, so imagine you have a set of grid cells and you're seeing when one becomes active. And for the most part, what they see is that the grid cells will always become active in every representation at just different locations. It's like you don't see ones that, for the most part, you don't see ones that are not active at those locations. If you had a real sparse representation, you'd see a grid cell that wouldn't become active at some location where it might have otherwise. You follow what I'm saying about that?
yeah,
Now, there actually is evidence for that. I can show you that. I have a paper on my laptop where they say, hey, we expect this grid cell to become active, once a grid cell becomes active, and you know its direction, it's supposed to become active here, 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 then people have observed that it may not become active at this location reliably on a particular object. It's like this grid cell should become active here, but it doesn't. On this object. On a different object, it would be a different grid cell this time. But it's not like I see, like most of the points are not active. It's like one drops out. I can show you this paper. One drops out reliably. So if I'm looking at the can, I'm moving along the can, this grid cell should be active here, it doesn't become active. If I'm looking at something else, it does become active. And another cell may become active.
no, like it never becomes active or
On
just
that
not as
object.
reliable.
On that, no, it just totally blank. I can show you the paper of it, and I talked to the researcher about it.
Okay,
It's very reliable, and multiple people have seen this. They don't report it very much because they think it's like, they don't understand it.
yeah,
The common literature grid cells, that should be active every location, and,
so it's not like it's just less likely to
No,
become
it's
active. just
reliably-
off.
I
Okay.
talked to the researcher about it. It's reliably inactive.
Yeah,
The majority of the cells are active and
Majority of the cells are reliable. This is the annoying thing about it, because the majority of the cells are correct. Here, I'll show you. I have a picture of you. This is one of my favorite papers.
and we're talking a grid cell, so, and then that phase of the grid cell is never active, or it's not active at a particular location?
It's not active. The grid cell just doesn't become active at that location at all. I think it's at the end of the thing.
oh, it's the tank paper.
Yeah, the tank paper.
Oh, yeah.
Where is it? This is supplementary information. It's not in the supplement. It's somewhere else. It's at the end of the paper. Still supplementary. Okay. You see, there's a figure that represents, let me see if I can find that. Something I remember.
I've got a great set of notes that I wrote about tank paper. It just says tank paper plus plus, as if like to write more notes about the tank paper.
Oh, here it is. Now I'm entering the main part of the paper.
Yeah, I wanna read it again. I don't
it's-
remember.
Yeah.
It's one of these things, it's in here someplace.
Yeah.
Let's see here. C maybe, what does it say, C? Missed field patterns. Missed field patterns are highlighted field in B in 6 cells. So what is that? Run by run, significant. Okay, it's in here someplace. What is this one? Missed patterns. All right, I have to read this carefully. It's in here. And I think I wrote the tank about it. And I asked them. I can't remember exactly where it's represented here. But all right, I have to read it more carefully again, I guess. It's in here someplace. It's in this figure somehow, for these 2 figures. I think. Is that also up here? All right, well, unless you want to sit here and read the paper, which should take an hour. Here, bottom, missed field pattern of the field in each cell. So this is a missed field. So the cells should be active throughout the entire run somehow. And yet there are places where it reliably was inactive. It should have been active, but it was reliably inactive.
Yeah.
So this would be, and this is the actual
That's
data.
almost half of the,
Well, I thought it wasn't a lot, but maybe I'm misinterpreting it now. I can't remember. Maybe I got that wrong.
So I just want to make sure I understand it. So
Here's more about the misfield.
we're saying that the when we change the environment that they're running in, some of the cells should become active and they're not.
Right. So there's sort of almost 2 conflicting things here. One is like, oh, the animal doesn't know where it is. So you get one set of grid cells. Then the animal doesn't know where it is. It re-anchors. So, you know, the cells anchor at different locations. They're still active.
Mm.
And now you'd expect once they re-anchor it, now they say, oh, it's going to be here, not here. So it's an array of activity, a grid of activity that was here and now it's shifted someplace else. But in that scenario, it doesn't reliably become active in every location that it should become. But it's reliably inactive. It's like for this object, when you're at this location in an object, it's never active. So that's like the sparsification of a grid cell pattern, right? Saying, yo, great, I now have a set of grid cells that all should be active in some place. That's not enough to create unique representation for all objects. But now you start dropping them out, and it says no. So now these cells somehow become sparser.
Yeah.
And this was a piece of data that they don't have any explanation for. It wasn't, you know, an experimental missing or a cell was misbehaving. It's like a reliable thing. Anyway, see, these are multiple things that are sort of I'm throwing into the mix here.
yeah, that will be a useful mechanism if we want unique location
Right.
representation.
My recollection, it doesn't do it enough
Yeah,
to get us to the unique STR. But I mean, so when I first heard this, like, oh, this is great. Now we have an SDR formed with grid cells. You know, but it could be a clue to this thing. It could be like there's a base. I think it gets very much to this generalization. There's a base, maybe there's a base. How about this? There's a base anchoring for cylinder objects, and individual cylinder objects, you can drop out different, you know, you can do a set of, not a very, very large set, but a set of cylinder objects by dropping out somehow different grid cells at different locations.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you're predicting a sparser pattern of features as well. It's like before you drop them out, you're predicting all of the
Right, but again,
potential
if
features.
it's not a lot of dropout, what it means is that you'd have you'd have a set of grid cells that are active. And then, on a particular location, it's a subset of them.
And they're generally predicting the same features.
Well,
because-
there's a lot of overlap. It's not like
Yeah.
I went to a totally unique, it's like, I don't have a unique representation of that location on the object. I have a partially unique, right? Some of the things dropped out and some are still there.
I would have almost thought of it on a different level, that basically the unique, like the sparsification of the grid cells tells you what kind of object structure you're on, like cylinder, sphere, square, but then which specific cylindrical object it is depends on like what the features are in L4 then, because if you want to encode unique locations for all of the
Say
objects.
it again, I'm losing it. Say it. You thought, just start that paragraph over here.
Yeah, that basically the sparsification of the grid cells tells you what rough shape of object you're on instead of what specific object with that rough shape. So that the location representation for two cylindrical objects is the same in L6A, but then which specific cylindrical object it is determined by the active cells in layer 4.
But,
But I guess,
okay, but then I can't predict the specific from layer 6.
No, yeah, you wouldn't be able.
It's more than just generic. You're saying I'm
Yeah.
on a cylinder,
Yeah,
as opposed to some other shape object.
yeah, and that way it wouldn't be that big of a deal that it's not as sparse, because we only need to encode like a limited amount of.
But then now I move, I have to make a specific prediction.
we predict a union. But-
Well,
but-
no,
but
if
potentially-
I know I'm on the coffee cup,
No,
I'm
but when
touching-
you're on the cylinder.
well, I'm touching a cylinder, but I
Yeah.
know I'm on the coffee cup. The moment I'm not touching anything related to the coffee cup, I'm just touching the cylinder. But if I know I'm on the coffee cup, then when I move, I'm gonna make a very specific prediction. I'm gonna say like, oh, it's not just a cylinder. This is I should feel the handle. It's not like I'm gonna be surprised at the handles there. I know, at this point, I'm on the cylinder. I know that I'm on the coffee cup. Let's say I do, but let's say I touched the handle, I moved away. Now I know I'm on the coffee cup. I have to make very specific predictions for every,
Could that be biased from L3 connections to L4?
it could be, if you can come up with a way of doing it. It could, right? But I don't think there aren't many L3 to layer 4 connections, right? That's as far as,
I think there's some, but.
there's some,
yeah, I
but
don't-
it's a lot of
know
people
if
said
it's
it's
enough.
none. Is my bag in here?
So what you're saying is when we have the hierarchy, and we have the layer 3 to layer 4 connections,
I'll be right back.
and then we do the generalization stuff, the mapping stuff, then the two representations of the cup and one with a handle and one without are going to be very similar. And then the location in 6A in the higher region are also going to become more similar because the representation of those in the higher region are similar. So when that feeds back to 6A in the lower region, they become more similar. It kind of represents a cylinder more than an actual object in the higher region.